criticism of you in the Ledger-Inquirer in Columbus. The author talks about how, for a couple hundred pages, you didn't say you were a paralegal in this case. Talk about your access to this case. Were you a paralegal? And your interviews with Carlton Gary.
Well, for a long time, I got drawn into this slowly from about 1996, and you know, as soon as I looked at this case, I thought it just stank. I'd actually gone to Georgia initially to write an article for a British newspaper about the death penalty, and I went to Columbus because Columbus had sent more people to death row than anywhere else in Georgia. And indeed, per capita, may well have sent more people to death row than anywhere else in the United States. And, you know, I'd begun to find out about the case, and all kinds of things intrigued me. One of the most extraordinary things is that the defense had absolutely no money. They had no funding at all with which to defend Carlton Gary. And, of course, this was a very complex case with all kinds of scientific evidence that has turned out to be extremely questionable. But a senior judge, the chief judge of the circuit, a guy called John Land, who had a very interesting family background, had made decisions which meant he had no funding. And so as I started gradually to get drawn in, I went to visit Carlton many times. I mean, I think I've seen him 10 times now. I began to dig up evidence that further undermined the prosecution's case, which, beyond what had already come out at his state appeals, he was now in the federal court, in his federal habeas corpus appeal. And I felt that if I was coming up with evidence that could exonerate this man, I had a simple moral duty to share it with the defense. It would be wrong to stack up evidence over perhaps a period of years, as indeed turned out to be the case. I was working on this for about 9 years, which would then, if I didn't give it to the lawyers, they might miss a filing deadline. He could literally be executed on a technicality, in the sense there could be evidence out there which might well have got him a new trial, but he wouldn't get one because his lawyers had not filed it in time. So I said, look, I'm basically working as an investigator here. Why don't you make me officially a paralegal investigator? And I've been completely transparent about this. Well, okay, I mentioned it on page 200, but that's just where it happens in the narrative. And, you know...
It also gave you access to Carlton Gary.
Well, it gave me much better access to him. It meant that when I went into... I mean, you can go into death row as a friend, as a visitor, but you can't take any notes. So, you know, I would go in and see him, and he would pour out this story, tumbling out, desperate to tell me about his life, and I'd just be trying to remember it, and I'd get out into the parking lot, and I'd be scribbling notes. Once I was going in as a paralegal, I could take in documents, he could give me documents, and I could take notes. And I could do other things. On one occasion, I smuggled out his semen from death row.
How did you do this?
Well, I gave him an envelope and a piece of paper and some cling wrap, and I said, right, I'm going off for lunch. I'll come back this afternoon. You produce a semen sample in your cell, and I'll collect it later. And then when I did that, I gave him another envelope, and I said, right, pluck some hairs from your head in front of me, so I can then do a DNA cross-match between the hairs, the hair roots and the semen, prove it's your semen, and then we can test the semen. Now, I should say we couldn't do a DNA test. We couldn't just, you know, send off his semen and compare it with the crime scene samples, because the state claimed, and indeed the former district attorney of Columbus, now Superior Court Judge Doug Pullen, actually testified in his state appeal that the semen samples from the crime scenes had been destroyed because they were, as he put it, a biohazard. But what you could do was another kind of testing. In the 1970s, when these crimes happened, they did this thing called serology typing. Most people are what are called secretors. That means that in their other bodily fluids, such as semen or saliva, they excrete or secrete the blood group chemical, the antigen that defines you as blood group O, blood group A, and so forth. And it was quite clear from the tests that the killer was a non-secretor. They had tested Carlton Gary's saliva when they arrested him, and he, equally clearly, was a blood group O secretor. Well, the state's expert at the trial said, well, maybe he just changed over time, or maybe he was a secretor in his saliva but not his semen. And of course the defense, which had no money at the trial, couldn't challenge this. They couldn't call an expert to delve into this deeper. And in fact, you read the transcript, they're begging the judge for funds, and he won't give it to them. So the state was still sticking to this position in the federal court, and so I conducted this test to see if he really was a secretor in his semen, and of course he was actually found to be secreting about 10,000 times as much of the chemical as the killer was.
We're talking to David Rose, author of the Big Eddie Club, The Stocking Stranglings, and Southern Justice. David's a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and has worked at various British papers, The Guardian, The Observer, worked also with the BBC. Well, the title of your book is The Big Eddie Club. Talk about the Big Eddie Club.
Well, the Big Eddie Club is a venerable institution for Columbus's elite. It stands on a beautiful location on the Chattahoochee River, a promontory between the main river, which is dammed at that point, and a tributary, Standing Boy Creek. And it was founded by a wealthy industrialist in 1920 to provide a retreat for Columbus's richest families. And Columbus is a very wealthy place. It always has been. It's, you know, the place where Coca-Cola was financed. It's the home of Aflac, the huge insurance company, of the CB&T Bank, of other big corporations. And the Big Eddie Club, until 2006, was an all-white institution, and 5 of the victims of these murders were either members of the club or very, very regular visitors, as were all the senior white officials who were involved in prosecuting and trying Carlton Gary. And so, although I'm not suggesting that the club, you know, actually has a sort of functional role in the case, it's kind of symbolic of the way that things have been done in Columbus for a very long time. And also the fact that it has now admitted an African-American member, I think, is also evidence that Columbus, like many places in the South, is now beginning to change. And in fact, arguably, I think the criminal justice system there is one of the most resilient bastions of kind of old South values. It's most resistant to try to, well, perhaps come into the 21st century. But the club, you know, it's a place where people mingle and network, and you have to wonder whether, you know, the fact that these women were members of the club and the officials who prosecuted Carlton Gary were too, if that added yet another edge to the way that they prosecuted the case.
Award-winning